Welcome back to my channel. Today, we continue my series of book reviews and again discuss socialism with Kristian Niemietz' book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. I will state up front that this is another book I heavily agree with. Unlike the previous book I reviewed, this one is completely concerned with the socialist regimes of the 20th and 21st centuries. It never rigorously defines socialism, but instead relies more on the self-identification of socialist regimes. With this standard, over 24 such regimes can be listed, starting with the Soviet Union and the most recent being Venezuela. The focus of the book, however, is not really about the structure of the regimes themselves or the specific problems that they faced. These are discussed, but the simple reality is that they all failed economically to one degree or another and committed atrocities of varying degrees. Instead, more time is spent looking at how the West, particularly the left wing of the West, perceived these regimes and changed their rhetoric over time. I would say the best word to summarize that rhetoric is apologia, because the central theme of the book is how despite repeated, spectacular, and well-documented failures, socialism is remarkably resilient as a political and social motivator. The first thing to understand about socialism in the West is that it is popular. And not just socialism in abstract. Specific socialist policies tend to garner a surprising amount of support. The data Niemietz uses is from his home country, the UK, but I do not think it is too much of a stretch to generalize it to the rest of the West. Niemietz gets into various reasons for this popularity, but most of them can be summed up as some variation of viewing the public sector as more moral than the private sector because it is not driven by profit, and that collectivism benefits the people over the elites because it focuses on the distribution of wealth and not its generation. People are not delusional about past socialist attempts. The evidence is simply undeniable that they did not work. But there is an almost mantra-like repetition of the phrase, not real socialism, in regards to those attempts. Real socialism has supposedly never been tried. All of these other attempts failed before they became socialist, and were just appropriating the term. This is obvious nonsense, but that has not made it any less persistent. Later, we'll look more closely at the various psychological reasons that people are able to maintain a positive view of socialism in the face of the evidence. But in regards to their own arguments, there are two main assumptions that proponents of socialism continue to make to sustain the not real socialism line. The first assumption is that the heavy-handed authoritarianism of socialist regimes was a deliberate choice, and that attempts to put the people in charge and implement equality and social democracy were disingenuous. In essence, socialists deny any natural linkage between their policies and the dictatorships that result. They view the world through the concept of political will, believing that achieving a political end simply requires a critical mass of people working towards that end. Failure just means that the people lacked the will. Unfortunately for the socialists, everything we know about society rejects the idea that it is simply a ball of clay that can be manipulated into any conceivable shape. Socialists have a bad habit of ignoring human nature and recurring results. Not only is it likely that the authoritarianism is correlated with socialist policies, but the causal link can be explicitly demonstrated. Niemietz goes into greater detail about this in the book, but the gist of it is that the nuts and bolts of trying to control every aspect of an economy will eventually force centralization, and the inflexibility of the socialist system forces that centralization to be particularly draconian. The second assumption that Niemietz points out is that socialists believe that their policies are not just moral, but when implemented would actually be effective. There seems to be a few different rationales for this, with most bringing up the argument that socialism is not based on greed like capitalism supposedly is, and that the common man can better organize an economy than the propertied elite. I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to that later argument. Too much centralization definitely is not a good thing. But as mentioned previously, socialism does not lead to decentralization, it leads to more centralization. And when comparing socialism in practice to free enterprise in practice, socialism does not come out looking good. History has even given us two excellent comparative examples of this. The first being West and East Germany, and the second, North and South Korea. In both cases, not only did the capitalist country drastically outperform its socialist counterpart, but in the case of the Koreas, did so with essentially every economic advantage being held by the socialist member of the pair. Again, Niemietz goes into more advanced detail in the book about the key reasons for the extreme differences in performance, explaining how socialism removes all the tools which the free market uses to handle and process economic information, the unfortunate result being the shortages and famines that socialism is so well known for. These underlying assumptions about socialism go a long way in helping us understand the main portion of the book, which is about how academics, journalists, politicians, and other such intellectuals in the West reacted to and commented on the socialist regimes of the last century. Niemietz points out how, despite it being obvious at this point to objective observers that socialist experiments will inevitably result in failure and suffering, that reality has apparently not made its way into left-wing discourse. He identifies a three-stage process that follows the life cycle of every new regime, be it the Soviet Union 100 years ago, or Venezuela of the 21st century. The first stage in this process has been dubbed the honeymoon period. It is characterized by the flurry of optimism and utopian prophesizing that happens whenever a socialist movement manages to wrestle itself into power. Often, these claims are buttressed by the fact that socialist regimes are often, at least on the surface, initially successful. Mass upheaval and restructuring of society certainly is impressive, and accomplishing it without collapsing into pure anarchy certainly seems like some kind of accomplishment. This makes it difficult to truly grasp what is going on at the ground level and lends credence to, this time it'll be different. Niemietz points out that the most important thing to note about this phase is that when all socialist regimes start out, no one is denying that they are real socialism. As an example, in China, when Mao started really implementing his most infamous programs, such as the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, you would have been hard-pressed to find a socialist commentator in the West who did not think it would become anything less than paradise on earth, despite many, if not most of them, having already soured on the Soviet Union for becoming a despotic and totalitarian nightmare. And these are the same people who were willing to give Vietnam a try when the Chinese experiment failed, and then Cambodia after that, etc., etc. That brings us to the second phase that Niemietz identifies, the excuses and whataboutery period. This corresponds to the time in the lifespan of a socialist regime when the cracks begin to show, when economic growth fails to meet expectations, when famines and shortages ravage the population, and when the inevitable political purges, executions, and massacres begin to be made public. It is when the reality of the situation becomes undeniably discordant with the idealism of rhetoric, and as a result, requires socialism's proponents in the West to run defense for it. As can be derived from the name Niemietz gave it, the main two forms of defense that they employ are excuses and finger-pointing. When it comes to excuses, the most common ones used are sabotage and interference. The phrase capitalist sabotage, or some variation thereof, has been used in almost every country that has dabbled with socialism. The CIA wishes it had the reach and power some of these people ascribe to it. This echoes our earlier discussion about the first assumption socialists make about socialism, how it would work if the political will was there. Here, they say it would work if the opposition was not there. Even if this was true, I do not understand why anyone would support such a fragile system that is always just one black market entrepreneur away from collapsing it. But I digress. The other favorite defense that commonly gets employed is whataboutism and finger-pointing. This is a technique in which valid criticisms are simply ignored, and instead, an attempt is made to redirect the conversation towards the problems of capitalism, some capitalist country, or some other scapegoat. Common avenues of attack are bringing up colonialism, racism, inequality, fascism, or any number of other favorite talking points of the political left. They're not even always completely wrong in their critiques, but that does not make it any less of a disingenuous tactic. It is simply an attempt to avoid having to answer hard questions and drag everyone else down into the mud. This brings us to the third and final stage, which Niemietz dubs the not real socialism period. This corresponds with the final stage in the life cycle of socialist regimes, when all the masks come off, and the brutal reality of what socialism does is put on full display. At this point, the only people that are able to continue support for these regimes are those actually in the regimes, and the small fringe of radicals who so vehemently hate the West that their opposition to capitalism and liberalism overshadows and comes before any support they had for socialism as an ideal. This leaves all of the other socialist sympathizers in the West with the task of distancing themselves from both the regime itself and all of their previous support for the regime. This is what leads us to that infamous phrase, not real socialism. Since the outcome was not what they wanted, then obviously it is and always was an abomination, even though it is coming from the same people who cheered for it until the last possible moment. Often, this not real socialism rhetoric is coupled with outrage and disgust that critics would even dare compare their lofty ideals to the barbarism that appears in practice. How dare you hold the atrocities of the Bolsheviks, Viet Cong, and Khmer Rouge against the innocent academic and his noble beliefs? Stalin, Mao, and Kim Il-sung were just fascists in disguise and have nothing to do with real socialism. This is obviously just deflection and an attempt to avoid responsibility. But unfortunately for everyone that desires sane politics, this deflection tends to work and allows this cycle to be repeated over and over again. Niemietz dedicates the vast bulk of the book to going through and documenting this three-step process and how it took place in regards to the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, North Korea, Cambodia, Albania, and East Germany. In 5 of the 7 countries, this process happened almost verbatim. The 2 exceptions are Cuba, which seems to be perpetually stuck between phases 2 and 3, and East Germany, which due to its close ties with the Soviet Union and unique birth is kind of in a category all its own. I will leave it to the listener to explore Niemietz' research on their own, except I'll point out one thing I found interesting while going through his compilations. The people quoted are not nobodies that the public has never heard of, but are often very influential people, some of them still being active today. Darling of the left, Noam Chomsky, wrote 2 books attempting to deflect criticism away from Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, a group which killed off somewhere between a fourth and a third of the entire Cambodian population. An influential British politician, Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, appears multiple times. There are probably many other names that people will recognize. The last major section of the book steps away from the arguments and economics of socialism to look at the psychology behind its appeal and persistence. I'm particularly convinced by the third of the 4 models he suggests, but the reality is that all 4 of them are probably contributing factors, and they are all convincing in their own right. The first model that he suggests is called the social intuitionist model, developed by psychologist Jonathan Haidt. According to Haidt, most of our moral and political reasoning is post hoc rationalization. That is, people usually reach a conclusion about some topic, and then use rationalizations to justify that opinion. He explains that within our brain, it is the emotional sections that actually forms opinion, which then employ the logical portions to play defense like a lawyer. This results in some noticeable behaviors in people. When someone with strongly held beliefs is challenged with new evidence, they will change their arguments but not the opinion. If they feel their own arguments are too weak, they will switch to trying to pick holes in the opposition's argument. This is in accord with the 3-stage cycle of socialism, apologia, discussed in this book, and really should be familiar to anyone who has ever engaged in political debate. Haidt does give some suggestions on how to overcome this phenomenon. For one, when a person does not have strong emotional attachments to an opinion, they can typically be reasoned with. Second, forming an emotional connection with someone that has a differing opinion will lessen the hostility and make them more amenable to new and different ideas. but it is still difficult and requires a remarkable amount of intellectual self-discipline to change a deeply held belief. The second model that Niemietz suggests is somewhat a derivation of the first. It is called the rational irrationality model and was developed by psychologist Bryan Caplan. It is incredibly simple and expands on what is required for someone to discard an opinion. Essentially, he points out that some beliefs are emotionally appealing and can thus offer a benefit to the individual irrespective of whether they are true. And the only way that someone will change such a belief is if the cost of holding it eventually outweighs the benefits of keeping it. This becomes particularly devilish when applied to political and economic opinions, because even though bad opinions in those fields can lead to bad policies that hurt everyone, the cost of those decisions are dispersed across all of society. Because of this, it is incredibly difficult for individuals to connect their opinions to the effects of those opinions, even if society itself is collapsing around them. A perfect example of this is modern-day California, which continues trying to double down on their economic policies while simultaneously becoming a failed state. The third model that Niemietz offers is my personal favorite, and is the intuitive anti-capitalism model. This model is first derived from simple observation. As pointed out earlier in the book, socialism is far more popular than capitalism is in abstract. More generally, anti-capitalism seems to be a default human opinion, so why might this be? The most convincing reason is that for most of our history as a species, we existed in a state that could be described as semi-socialist. This is referring to hunter-gatherer tribal society. While not socialist in any ideological sense, it was socialist in regards to from all according to their ability to all according to their needs. It is also hard to be capitalist when there simply was no capital and everyone moved around all the time. Civilization as we know it did not start until we began utilizing agriculture and permanent settlements. During this prehistory, the most valuable thing a person could contribute to the group was earnest intent to promote the welfare of the group. The requirements of capitalism, being able to control the fruits of your own labor and having unilateral control of your own property, would have been seen as selfish and greedy. These emotional predispositions still exist in humanity today, even when the social and economic landscape have changed so drastically, and when capitalist methods and free enterprise have been shown to be infinitely more successful at generating wealth. The last model that Niemietz proposes is called the Gary Lineker fallacy, named after the famous sportscaster who would jokingly define soccer as a game in which 22 men chase a ball for 90 minutes, and, in the end, the Germans win. The reason this is important is because it confuses ends with means. If something is defined by its end, it will never exist until it reaches that end, and thus what happens until that point is irrelevant. Socialists love to do this, both knowingly and not. This is the essence of the not real socialism mantra. If socialism is defined by its results, then real socialism really never has been tried, because there has never been a utopia. But there never can be a utopia, so allowing this kind of slippery wordplay would give socialists free rein to justify anything in the pursuit of socialism, since they have disconnected themselves from the process. This is ridiculous. Attempts at socialism are just as socialist as the ideological end result. The end of the book is a bit different from the rest because it is a piece of fiction, but fiction so convincing you would think it is fact. It is a piece of alternate history, speculating on what would have happened if in 1990, East Germany had decided to try socialism again. He prefaces it with some of his views on the various novels that have critiqued socialism, explaining why he believes that some of the most famous ones, such as Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, were inadequate because they fall into the trap of making the assumptions we discussed earlier. Which should not be surprising. For all of his criticism of the Soviets, Orwell still was a self-avowed socialist. Instead, Niemietz argues that a proper critique of socialism must focus on the economics. To accomplish this, he structures the rest of his piece as a series of news articles which take place over the lifespan of this new socialist experiment. It ends up being quite harrowing and convincing for two reasons. One, he steelmans all of the arguments. In this fictional state, everything that could go right does go right. This helps illustrate how it is not bad actors that cause socialism to fail, but the policies themselves. Second, all of the articles he writes are based on real journalistic pieces written about the various regimes discussed in the book. He's not making these things up, just piecing them together to make the narrative and inevitable trajectory more apparent. After having read the book and the ideas it presents in abstract, this is strikingly effective. It really helps illustrate it with concrete imagery. The last piece, in which a Guardian article is pivoting away from the not real socialism of East Germany to the new hope of Venezuela, is particularly ironic. Altogether, I cannot recommend this book enough. Some of the data is specific to the United Kingdom and may be lost in those not affiliated with British politics, but the vast majority of the book is universally applicable. It is not even necessary to read the entire book. The introduction, first and last chapters, and conclusion contain most of the original arguments that I have discussed. The other 7 chapters can be read through at leisure, as they mostly exist to document and substantialize the other claims. Add it to your reading list, and then come back and let me know what you think. Hello everyone. If you like my work, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share it with anyone else you think would be interested. If you didn't like what I had to say, let me know that as well. Criticism is always welcome. If you're watching on YouTube, you might want to consider following me on Rumble, BitChute, or Odyssey as well, links to which can be found below. Lastly, if you really like my content, please consider helping me monetarily. Links to my Patreon and Subscribestar are below, as well as a PayPal link for one-time donation. Regardless, thank you for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.